Hey, so you probably found this video because you're looking to make some nice animations to go alongside your music, but you don't want to just make one and done and that's it. Like, you probably want to make a whole variety of different animation assets that you want to apply to a whole bunch of different music. So I thought, let's go through the process of using Blender to create some beat sync animations and then being able to export it in a way so we've got a whole bunch of different video assets that we can use for a whole bunch of different projects. So let's get straight into it. Alright, I'm just going to jump straight into Blender here, and yes, I'm using 3.3.0. This is their long-term support version. If you haven't got Blender already, definitely jump over there and grab it, because like with long-term support, a lot of these features are going to be around for a while, so it's quite easy. And yes, I've just gone about making this cool little scene. I don't need to see my assets anymore, but this has got a few little bits in here, and I've got a few animations going, but I want to beat sync this to a frame rate. And right now it's like everything could work and I could make this into a loop and move on, but we need to set up our scene in a way and get some understanding first, because this is really tied into the actual frame rate itself. So if you click the little printer here and go to output, we have our frame rate option here. And what we're trying to do is, like, in modern sense, we don't really need to focus on the frame rate as much. Like if we create like a 60 frame per second version, we can use like DaVinci Resolve, which is a free to access, really good video editing software, and we can like time stretch to match the beat here. But in a more traditional sense, you're trying to match the frame rate of the footage that you're taking, especially if you're taking video. So usually I work in 29.7 or 24. I'm just going to keep it in 24 for this scenario, just because it's a whole number and just makes our job a little bit easier. And we need to do a bit of math to figure out our frames per beat, because we got our frames per second here. We need to convert that into a frame per minute, and then we can use that to calculate our beats per frame, so how many that goes in. So if we go into a calculator, so we've got 24 frames, times that by, we've got 60 seconds. So currently we have 1400 frames that we've got. And then if we divide that by our frame rate, so typically I make songs around 128 beats per minute. So if I divide that by 128, should give us a rough number. Oh, 11.25. That's a pretty good number. I just picked a random frame rate, but we sort of want that whole number because we need to fit that into our animation. And Blender by itself, like if I just go back into Blender, these are sort of calculated on the tens, but if we keep zooming in, we've got our fives, and then if you zoom in a little bit more, it goes to twos, and then it jumps down to ones. So usually I try to stick with like base 10 or base 5. So with our calculator, what I might do is get that 1440, divide it by 10, 144 beats per minute. So that would be something more like drum and bass or something along those lines. So currently I just animated to like 100 frames. It's just easy for me to work in that frame rate. But what I might do, just grab these, move them down. Actually, I'll select all three. So I've got all the animation data sitting there. Grab them, bring that down to 40, and then grab this slot here, grab it here, and then if I bring that to 80, so that's 1 bar, that's 2 bar, and then we'll probably cycle it again. So if I make the end result 160, that's that. And yeah, I probably will write a table of some sort so you can reference your frame rate to like the relevant frames per second. If you don't want to go down this route and like have those decimal points, like what you would be doing is, like, say if it was that 11.25, and I need to animate here, I'll probably just drop it down to 11, but when it's like 3 frames in, so 11, 22, 33, that would be 33.75, I'll probably bump it up. So I'm just rounding it to the closest whole number here. So 34 would be where I animate to. So that's currently synced. I'm just going to work on these first 80 frames because I want to animate in a few different ways. So I'm just going to set that as 80. So now we're in a bit of a thing. I've just animated this per the default settings, and if we just watch it, as you can see, it sort of slowly comes in and slowly comes out. And I sort of want it as a linear animation first. And this is just the default of the keyframe. So what we can do, we can hit right click, or we can hit the T on the keyboard, and that will bring up this menu here. And we've got a few different ways we can animate. So we've got linear, we have all these exponential ones that we'll use later. We've got a Bezier curve. We can also control the handle type, so how the animation comes in and goes out. And yeah, easing as well. So how fast we want something to come in. So if it's got full easing, it's going to take full advantage of the interpolation mode. I'm just going to set this to linear. So if I play this, this should be an equal amount of time to do the animation and pass through. So what I can do now is I can just turn this around to that 10 spot. So it's currently sitting at 25%, or should be pretty close to 25% if I check this animation here. So what I can do is, with all three selected, I'm just going to hit I on the keyboard there. Alright, so I've just gone through and animated each one on that beat. So 4 on the floor, it's going to hit every note, but right now it's still that linear animation. So if I hit T on the keyboard or right click again, now we can use some of these easing types to try and create like a sort of hit on the actual timing. So if I switch that to say something like cubic, this one is going to appear more on the beat than the ones on the inside. So there we go. 3, 4. We can make that more aggressive. So we can say this one. Experience in the camera. Cool. So with just a few, like, we don't need to go into the graph editor and start really tweaking the settings. We can get a pretty good rough out of like the type of animation that we want to have. But this is where I sort of treat the timeline as a way to make a drum machine. Like, I've got a few of them behind me that I use quite a lot. And there are some really cool things that we can do to create our drums. So creating that rhythm and then bringing that into 3D space and showing the rhythm is going to create some really interesting animations. So it's like right now we've got this highlighting the 4 on the floor, so that sort of kick drum with a like sort of pattern like boots and cats, or it's like we have the second and fourth. So these two steps here we could accent for our snare. That could be some way we could rotate, and we sort of have our hi-hats in between here, so we could have like something happening every 5 frames to sort of accent that sort of hi-hat. And then when we time stretch to any sort of beat that has that sort of rhythm, fit really nicely. But there's a couple of other things that we can do with rhythm itself. Like we can do things like polyrhythms, where instead of having divisions of 4, we can have other types of divisions supporting it. So right now, this center ring here, I've animated with thirds. So if I just select A, we're going to hit T, I had a quintric and go to the top so we can see what's going on. So this would be really nice for like some sort of Moroccan or some other beat. So it's like we can layer on top of animations. I think what would be really cool is to go over to a drum machine and have a look on how they actually work. Alright, I thought I'd take some time away from Blender to actually make a beat. So we can sort of go through some of the sort of ideas that go into constructing a drum groove that we can apply to animation. And I picked the Poly and Play to sort of give the demo on because it's got this really nice button grid that we can sort of draw out animation and actually make some grooves with it. So like I was saying before, we sort of create a drum groove from that, and I'm just going to program in that basic sequence. And then if we turn that up to 144, that would be what our little animation is syncing to. So like I was saying, we can, instead of a kick, we'll pick a snare. Cool, so then we could create an animation layer that was every 20 frames. So right now this is 16 steps, so 16 frames, 16 steps, but we can consider this our frame rate. So one beat, which is however long that is, say 10 frames, so 10, 20, 30, 40. And this would be on the 20th frame and then the 40th frame. And if we were to take that another step, and add our hi-hat, we would add our hi-hats here. And that's a typical Boots and Cats sort of style drum kit. So what happens if we wanted to create some sort of like drum and bass where it's like a little bit more tilted? So that's what we got now, but what we can do is we'll remove these ones, so we just live with the basic sort of drums. And with drum and bass, usually what happens is that is put over here. So if we listen to this now, probably not the right sounds for it, but that's all like how that animation would run. So if we were to come back to our little drum and bass track, sometimes we would do things where we accent note. So right now I've got this kick here, and then I can change the actual sample to be a little bit more clicky. So if we were to just solo that, so when we like create our drum grooves, like we're looking at ways we can accent that. So how you do your keyframes, so you could have like an object that you want to apply like the main animation to, like our little circle that's spinning around. But if you want to accent the notes, like we could increase the thickness of our cylinder, and that would be a really cool effect to accent a note. Now I want to talk about a bit about polyrhythms. So polyrhythm is something where we can have like a standard unit that is fitting into the grid alongside our main one, which is a bit difficult to program on something with 16 steps. Like I could sit there and move some of the notes around. So if I just, where would they be? So here's an example. I've just done some micro moves in that. So if we solo each one, so it's a pretty even, and that's a 4. So we got a 4 and a 3. And as you saw, I did have to do some fiddling to get this off the grid into like the spaces here. So when we come to our animation, we don't have the luxury of like pushing a keyframe either side, but we can either find a number that's divisible. Like when I was doing my 10, I found out I could do 15 and 30. We'll have a look at that back in the animation. But I was able to create that third animation, or following 3 beats in a 4/4 beat. And this sort of leads into another thing, like if I just mute that channel and bring drum groove back, there's also things like you can do like a fake rhythm, where if I pick I'm just going to pick a different height, something like that. And I like working in 3s when it comes to some beats. But see here how it's a sort of fake out when it comes around here. We solo that. See how it adds so much more rhythmic flair to what you're working on. But this is a lot easier to program into a keyframe sequencer. So this is nice to accent. Just make sure with the music that you're working on, it does sort of have this sort of rhythmic flair. You can sort of listen and hear it out if you want to follow along. But it's like, because we've got our main like beat supported, having a little bit of animation out on the side that we're working on that includes this sort of element, like it won't go astray from the animation. It's not going to take away from the main beat. It'll just add a little bit more flavor. And then when it syncs up with a rhythm like this, that is really interesting. So mucking around with this groove, I've done a little bit of work with playing with the chant. So as you can see here, skip 3, play 1. So this is now a much more extended beat, and you'll probably find this with music. It's not just a static 4/4 that's repeated over and over and over again. Like there's elements that are coming in and coming out, and we sort of want to reflect that in our animation. So right now, this will play 4 times or 3 times and then do like a fill, and then we'll come back again. So I've just got this track muted here because that's something else I want to explain. But it's going to play through. We've got a second part. There could be a different variation in there. So we had a little bit of something different. So when we're writing sort of keyframes, like if we have like one beat and just duplicate that as we go along, it'd be kind of boring. So when we come to like actually programming beats and having like on the 4/4 and then coming into like that 4th bar, we can do a bit of a fill or change up our animation and make something a little bit special. And then this part here, that's sort of like a sort of that explosive hit that comes into the next section. So just a different element that we could add to animation. But really this is something quite interesting. There could be some different variants in here that would happen. But overall, like this is a very interesting groove now compared to how we had at the start. It's a lot longer. So when we create animations, we could either decide to make shorter little animations that we can bring into DaVinci and swap and change them. So it's like I can make an animation for like this bass beat, and then when I get into like that fourth section, I have a second animation that I can plonk down and fill that gap. So it's got a little bit of difference. And then they become sort of like Lego blocks as we go through and program our beat. So what I might do, I'm just going to sit here and make a little bit of a drum that I'm going to use to put with that little animation loop. So we've got something that we can put together and have something that we can show at the end of it. Alright, so I hope that's given you a bit of food for thought, because coming back into Blender, I've done a bit of work here to sort of highlight some of those principles. So if I just play this animation now, like you can see that outer ring is pulsing, it's also keeping beat. We have that like triplet going as well as the center is sort of clapping to the hi-hats in the center. I just threw in a different shape just to add some context and change a bit of the framing just to have it a little bit nicer. But I think this is in a really good position to try and export out and put into something. So what I like to do here is just like go through the process of putting it out. So just before we move on, I just wanted to highlight this is all done with those basic tools. Like if we just right click the handle type, I didn't even touch in this one, but sometimes these are really useful to sort of bend the shape, as well as using these tools. So these ones are quite soft, as you go down the list it gets really steep. Your constant is sort of like it will just immediately jump up to value and just keep with it, and Bezier gives you a little bit more control. These ones are really cool as well, like if you want to add like a bounce to your animation, that's a really nice way. But if I just jump into the animation side, like we can sort of look at the bits that we're working on. So just selecting a few of these groups, see how we've got those ease ins and ease out. For that pulse on this one, what I did was I created an ease in, so it slowly came in, and then selected these two to create that ease out. So you don't really need to come into like the technical side of animation. Like these can really just be done with a few tools in this layout. And what I'm going to do now, we don't really need to look at the rest of the stuff. We're going to prepare for exporting. First thing, I'm going to do this in Eevee. So Eevee is their real-time engine. There is cycles as well. I do like this flat style, and that's what I was aiming for. But yeah, if you've got like a high-end graphics card, you might be able to look at using cycles, which just adds a little bit nicer on top. So I'm just going to set that to GPU compute. Depending on CPU or GPU, like I've got a 1080, but you can get some really nice render results. But for this one, I'm just going to stick with Eevee. It's going to look a lot nicer when we render it. So see how the shadows are a lot nicer and smooth. So yeah, everything is sort of prepared. And then what I want to do is jump straight into the render properties, or the output properties. So the little printer, 1920 by 1080, that's what I commonly work in. And I do a lot of the readjusting the frames in post, so using like DaVinci Resolve. So that's like a 1:1 ratio, like Instagram, or your vertical ratio, that's your TikTok. So when I'm doing the framing, I like to keep in mind different size boxes to support my renderer. So some visual interest for like a horizontal screen, but really it clamps down on our part. So 80. Like the renderer does scale out here, so that's all why I have the like most widest scale, and then I will cut in post. And 1080p works really well for me. Like animation itself, sometimes you see them down res, so you will like 1080, you can render in 4K as well, so you need to punch in the variables there. Like I said before, 24 frames per second. Sometimes I'll animate at either 129.7, that's sort of the other one I use, or I come down into these ones because we do get those extra frames to play around with. So with our frame range, as I said, I'm going to put it at 160 because that is 4 bars of 4:4. So that's all the animation that I need to render out, which should be relatively quick. We don't need to deal with any of that stuff. All right, now we're at a point where we can output this thing. And right now it's currently set up to like a temp file. We want to change that. So usually what I do is I'll have a working file that's in my project. So if I go here, input, this is the current files for this project, and just put it in as a loop. So I'm just going to just call this loop 1, accept. and that's set up to go, and we need to think about the ways we want to output it. So usually when I make these little types of animations, I usually like saving them as a video file. So when it comes to that, I will set this to FFmpeg video, RGB, come down here to encoding, and we're going to select MP4. I just find that works in a lot of different video editors really easily. QuickTime, if there's some other like RGB, I want the alpha channel. These settings are good, but I usually like it set to perceptually lossless. Just the color stays the same, and pretty much this is my basic render setup. So all I need to do now is I can come up to here, click render, and render animation. And as we can see, it's going to start going through the frames, and we'll see up in this little corner, it's doing it relatively quick. So this is a really nice position to be in. We're going to have our animation, and I think right now I'm going to try and overlay that beat that I had and just have this animation playing in the background and see what you guys think at the end. So if you did like this one, definitely give it that thumbs up, because it does help the algorithm point this video to other people, someone that might be looking to create some animation loops for their videos and music. So, and if you had any comments or queries or just a general question about certain things, please feel free to leave them down below. I'm happy to come in and sort of give a bit of extra discussion on this topic, because it is quite broad, but making these loops are really fun as well. It gives a bit of creative outlet to whatever. So if you have tried this and enjoy it, definitely feel free to check out my other Blender content as well as the music stuff I do. And overall, I hope you had a good time, and I look forward to seeing you around.